And we're beyond already the planetary boundaries of operating the way we currently do with the 7+ billion that we have. So it raises a bit of a math problem, right? I mean, how are we going to do this and feed the planet? People, clothe them, feed them, house them, healthcare issues around equity, gender. I mean, with 7+ billion, we can't do it and we aren't doing it well. What happens when we ratchet this up to 8 billion and 9 billion and maybe 10 billion? And the answer is it's not hopeless. It actually isn't that. It doesn't have to be that. We have some choice. And so this isn't a presentation to shame anybody, and I certainly don't want to send people out of here drinking or invite you to drink already at home. So what's going on? Well, sorry, but if you have a smartphone, if you have a fly fishing pole or rod or a shotgun with a shotgun shell, the math, science, and physics that propel and move those things around in your life are the same math, science, and physics that show that climate change is human caused, it's real, and it's happening now. And we're feeling the impacts. You'll see that person swimming through that goo. That's a real photo of somebody swimming through a waterway filled with phosphates and nitrogen that have overdosed and caused all kinds of green things to grow. What doesn't show, he's also swimming through microplastics and other things that don't belong on the waterways. Drought, we have not enough water in the places we need it and too much water in some places that we don't need it. And biodiversity loss, it sort of goes without saying, but a problem here across the board is we might solve or adapt to climate change, but if we don't stem the loss of biodiversity, predicted to be about 1 million species by the 2050s, we have an equal problem. By the way, if we don't actually bring all of us along in solving for these, and we leave a couple billion people behind, that issue of just, right? Development also comes into play. And then land use impacts. We see this in Maine. I mean, in southern Maine, where I think most of us are living, maybe with a couple of people from Zoom who aren't here. We see this somewhat here, but primarily through sprawl. But for those of us that work around the world, which I do, I spend most of my time, not in pandemic times, working outside of the country. This is a real issue. So these are systems issues. These are systemic, and they are truly integrated. So when Anthony comes on, I think we didn't rehearse this, we just met tonight, but these are not siloed issues. These are interconnected issues. If you don't remember anything else I say tonight, here's one thing you can do. So about 1/3 of the food we produce in the world never gets to a human stomach or to an animal stomach. And if you were to look at all the greenhouse gases from food waste in the world, it's a bigger footprint from a greenhouse gas perspective than Japan, Germany, or Russia. So if food waste were a country, it'd be the 3rd largest greenhouse gas emitter in the world. That's incredible. Forget the human cost, the water costs, the other costs, just remarkable. So food loss means that it never got to, it got lost somehow in production, and food waste means that it might have made it to a table or into a trough, but it never got consumed. So if you don't remember anything else I said, I'd really encourage you to work on food waste in your world, food loss if you're a producer growing your own goods. This one's extraordinary, and for those of us in the room that have worked in apparel and textiles, which is at least a couple of us, this is is it real for every t-shirt? Not necessarily, but it does take about 700 gallons to produce one t-shirt like this one. And that's all the way from farm to the cotton growing through the production. Lots of great, really important technologies are being incorporated into this to solve some of this, like reclaiming water, different kinds of drip irrigation and things like that. But these numbers are astronomical. So here, what's something that you can do rather than feeling helpless and never want to hear me speak again is buy less and do what good Yankees do, use it up. So the great news in a way is in my lifetime, if you did the math, you could probably figure out how old I am. Things have changed fairly dramatically. When I was born, resources were abundant. Now they're not. Talent was local. Now talent is global. I would also say talent was pretty much male and white. And thank God that's changing. Finance was centralized. Now we're watching through something called central bank digital currencies and other kinds of digital assets. We're seeing a move away from central authorities. So that's really threatening, wait for it, I'm going to mention some companies, to big financial institutions. Maybe I don't have to name them. You know who they are. Really disruptive times. People were trusting. We trust government in the 60s, and then things started to change. You can't blame it all on the Beatles or the Rolling Stones, or before them, Robert Johnson or anyone else. But, let's just say we have a bit of a trust issue. Can we say that globally right now? And technology was changing then, and it's changing now even faster. And certainly this pandemic we're still in has stopped almost everyone in their tracks, whether or not they were scrambling for toilet paper or paper towels or something else, Christmas shopping or Hanukkah or Kwanzaa shopping or whatever you're shopping for. All of a sudden, the pandemic, along with Black Lives Matter, and I would even say Me Too, have people thinking about what does a well-managed company look like and feel like? Do I work for one? Am I invested in one? Do I know somebody who works at one? Or maybe don't I? Or didn't I know? Or don't I really know what I need to know? And I think the answer to that is, well, it depends on who you are and how curious you are. But here's something interesting. So what's the number one ingredient in a can of Coca-Cola? Raise your hand if you're in the room and you know what the number one ingredient in a can of Coca-Cola is. Come on, you're smart. I know a couple of you have like double degrees. Counselor Stevens.
Water.
Water. Excellent. Bob Stevens gets a gold star. Ready? What's always been the number one ingredient in a can of Coca-Cola? Vala, you had your hand up too. What's always been the number one?
Corn syrup.
No, trick question. What's always been the number one? Susanna, Dr. Hancock. Water. So why was it that not until 2005 did Coca-Cola disclose publicly that water was an issue of material concern for the company? What the hell does that mean? Anthony will tell you. No, I mean, that means that up until then, this company, and I'm not throwing Coca-Cola under the bus, but we didn't necessarily require or think that we as the corporate community were required to disclose issues of mutual concern to those sort of beyond the boardroom and or the C-suite, the suite where most of the executives sat dispersed globally. So this is the first time that I know of that Coca-Cola actually disclosed in its public disclosure documents that water was an issue of material concern. And that is, to me, a bit of like forehead slapping. How is that possible? So it's not that companies are bad or good or thoughtful or unthoughtful. Things are changing. But isn't that interesting? 16 years ago, that company for whom water is, besides the formula and the bottle and that really elegant Coca-Cola script logo and this logo, I mean, it is the shop, right? Coke has about a $63 billion market cap just with those things I named. $63 billion of intangible assets without any Coca-Cola in a can. That's a lot of material issue. So lots of surveys like this have been done over the years. I've been involved in this. I know that at least one other person in the room knows a lot of this and has probably commissioned a lot of these surveys. So this is what a Big 5 or Big 4 accounting firm found this year. What do we say we care about? Well, you can read it there and folks on Zoom can see it too. Toxics, reducing carbon footprints, human rights, responsible sourcing, DEI stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. But here's the rub, and it's always been the rub. You see the 50-50 split, 50% of the people say they'll actually do something about it. They'll pay more for it. So here's the problem, right? We keep saying this is important, but we don't necessarily have buying behaviors that back that up or investing behaviors that back that up. So it's really a conundrum for companies and a company for people that advise investors and a conundrum for people like me who want to see change made. What I think people don't realize is we are actually paying for this because you're subsidizing agriculture, because you're subsidizing healthcare through allowing companies to make high caloric, not necessarily nutritionally high value foods. So, I mean, we are paying a cost here. It's just not as obvious as sort of we're used to. So what's the business case? Why do companies even care about this? Well, because they're fighting for you. The person that's clicking through the Zoom here, those of you online can't see this, is somebody that we'd love to keep. I know I would like to keep in Freeport, Maine and in Maine. You know, we're fighting over talent like all of you, fighting. I don't know if you saw this in the news. September was called the Great Resignation Month. 4 million Americans resigned their jobs in September. People have had it. Combine that with the fact that unless you're kind of crazy like all of us and know how wonderful Maine is, it's really hard to recruit to Maine sometimes. When I was at a famous company here for 10 years, it was really hard to get talent to come from a Patagonia in California or from a bicycle manufacturer in Colorado. Not easy unless you understand the magic of Maine. So there's a war for talent. I mean, the same companies that want a smart MBA from name your favorite graduate school are fighting for that same talent. And if you're from Cleveland, near where I'm from, it's really hard to compete against companies that are in Santa Monica. There's this war for talent. Customer demand, you saw my previous slide, and I've said there, growth opportunities. People, not me, have made trillions of dollars getting us into this mess, right? The climate, biodiversity, pollution, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's actually trillions of dollars to be made getting out of this mess. And I'd argue that's one of the ways we are going to get out of this. This needs to be monetized and incentivized in a way where really smart people start to put the shoulder to the wheel and go for this. And then regulatory and voluntary standards are really coming into play. So in October, I did my first conference in a year and a half in Colorado Springs. There was about $17 trillion of investor, it's called assets under management, AUM, in the room. And here's what, to Vali's great credit, I've made anonymous some of the companies in my presentation. Here's what the head of fixed income, so the debts, the debt and bond leader of this big bank, very famous bank, said at this meeting. You can read it for yourself, but basically what he's saying is that what you think is green ain't necessarily green. And it's not green because we're trying to lie. We just don't know. We don't really have the data. We're swimming in data, but it's based on estimates, not actuals, et cetera, et cetera. If you want to catch me after this or for a beer or a walk later, you'll understand more of what I'm talking about and why I've made this change in my career, but this is huge. So again, companies aren't necessarily intentionally, I think, trying to do the wrong thing or pull the wool over our eyes. But look, I mean, that's a stellar number. 80 to 90% of green bonds aren't green. That's actually illegal. We have at least one lawyer in the room that I know. That actually is something that you can't do. The Securities Exchange Commission, the Department of Labor, and many others have a big problem with that. If you're really bored and you're suffering from insomnia, you can read something I wrote that was published this year with 2 other co-authors that does a deep dive into the agriculture system here. And when I say we don't know what we don't know, we really don't. No one, it's not that I'm that smart, most of you know me, so you know that's true, but no one knew there's about $1 trillion annually flowing through the US agriculture system every year. Nobody had ever done that math. Unfortunately, most of it doesn't go to farmers, ranchers, and producers. And if you look at, not to pick on Starbucks, but to pick on Starbucks for a minute, you know, that latte that we might purchase, not even at Starbucks, we don't have to pick on them, but less than a nickel of that actually translates down to the grower, typically. And let's not pick on Starbucks, but it's pretty typical that for a Central American or South American coffee grower, about 5%, 5 cents of a $3 to $4 cappuccino, latte, or espresso actually would have flowed down to them. So big, again, systemic issues. So what can you do? What can we do? Well, okay, some of it's no-brainer and you know this stuff. Limit use of single plastics, buy seasonal produce, buy local. That goes for non-food goods, reduce air travel. We can talk about offsets in a minute if you want to. Reduce the amount of new products and goods you buy. Remember that 700 gallons to make a t-shirt? Wear that t-shirt out. It's cool to have holes in your stuff now. Do your homework. Read the label. Look for certifications. Do your homework. Don't believe me. Find out for yourself. You have this thing called the internet. You know, you can do the Google and find some of these things out. And again, if you don't remember anything else I've done tonight, I said tonight, try and eliminate food waste to the extent that you can. Dee Dee and I ate a beautiful pork dinner this weekend, had leftovers last night. I eat meat, but there really is this fundamental dynamic in terms of feeding an animal to create protein versus growing protein with, or eating the protein that's used to feed the animal ourselves. As someone said once, mammals are not a great protein converting mechanism. So it is unfortunately a problem. And if we want to feed 9 to 10 billion people the protein amount that they need, we aren't going to solve that with animal protein, full stop. That doesn't mean we're going to not eat animals. Switch to renewable energy, easier than it's said. If you drive a Tesla in Oklahoma, you're much greener than if you drive a Tesla in other places, lots of wind power out there, lots of solar power out there. If you're driving a nice e-car, but you're charging it from coal or from other non-renewables, it's a problem, not to mention the cobalt that was probably harvested by people who were enslaved in the Congo, not to ruin your night. Elected officials respond and they want to hear from us. I mean, they really do. And regulatory authorities like the Securities and Exchange Commission, like Governor Mills' work, like the town council, I mean, they want to hear from us, and they want you to advocate for things up to a point. They want you to be informed, and they want you to do it in a way that they can then digest and use. So you got to figure out how to play that one. Dee Dee suggested and strongly encouraged me to remind people around your home and yard, there are certain things you can do. I mean, do you really need to put any more chemistry on your yard these days? It's just hard to reconcile having that green of a yard in a world in which, probably it drains within 5 or 10 minutes into the ocean. And look for financial investments whenever possible that have an ESG focus. And Anthony's here to tell us about that. I'm not. This didn't come through in the white color I'd hoped, but here are a couple of things that I really want you to think about. The top one is called the Bank for International Settlements. There really is an entity in Europe. It's not Europe, it's actually Switzerland. Switzerland doesn't consider itself the European Union. Founded after World War I because France demanded reparations from Germany. After World War II, after the Bretton Woods meeting in 1944, the Bank for International Settlements became the central bank for the world's central banks. So while there isn't a Club of Rome and 6 people actually don't run the world, there is something called the Bank for International Settlements that is, again, the world's central bank for central banks. So if you're wondering about monetary policy or what the Federal Reserve's doing, or you need to go find these people, BIS.org. I can barely read it, sorry about that. The Sustainable Development Goals, the world voted about 5 to 7 years ago on 17 explicit goals called the Sustainable Development Goals. Even countries that are on our blacklist voted for these. There are 17 agreed rules with 160 plus indicators that back them up on what it would take to get to a world where everyone could live a high quality life. GreenBiz, if you're curious about the work that I do and some other people in the world do, greenbiz.com is an excellent resource for sort of green business news. If you're curious about offsets, you travel a lot, TerraPass is a great place. How Good is a really interesting site that corporations use to look at the ingredients and materials they use and do sort of a mass balance to find out what's better than or less better than. Choose Finch or Flinch. Can't even read it. I can't remember if it's Flinch or Finch. I just found yesterday is a great place for you normal people, me, normal people to go and look at ratings of different products. And then I'm not endorsing Shell, or I'm not here to endorse anybody, but if you're curious about carbon markets, Shell's actually published with the Boston Consulting Group a pretty good overview. Just remember, you're reading something written by Shell and one of the world's largest management organizations. So that's the end of my piece. Questions and comments can come later, correct? Anthony, I'm going to invite you up here. You're up.
All right, so your presentation.
Yeah, that looks like it.
Is that. All right. And I'm gonna upload it.
How's that? How's that? Great. I have to remember to not walk away from the podium because I think I drag technology with me. Good to go? Great. All right. Well, hello, everybody. David, that was terrific. It's a privilege to follow you up here at the podium. And my job is to talk a little bit about responsible investing, sustainable and responsible investing. I will say that it's great to be in person with some people. Again, it's been far too long. The last time I was in this room, it was for a piano recital. For those of you who can't see on the Zoom, there's a piano over in the corner. And my kids, I have 4 kids. A couple of them are actually here in the back of the room, but they were all playing the piano. It was a piano recital. It was Nadine Bowder's piano recital. So it's nice to be back in the room, and we don't have music, but hopefully at least we have rich and compelling content. So let me jump right into it. I think David did a terrific job, not only with data points, but also connecting the dots to real world impact. I think your comment about food waste, I think I picked up somewhere along the ways, and you probably know it, is that if you took all the food waste in the world, it would be a top 5 country from a greenhouse gas emissions perspective, maybe even top 3. So absolutely concur with your assessment there. But so let's jump into it, and hopefully this will get people thinking, and will lead to some questions when we have time for Q&A. I do work for a responsible investment company, but I'm absolutely not here to market those services at all. If I need to align with an association, then I will align with the nonprofit industry organization, USIF, the Forum for Sustainable and Responsible Investing, which in the introduction was mentioned, I am a director of. But the reality is there are headlines out there in society. They are impacting companies. You can see some of them up on the screen here. Issues around sort of greenwashing, issues around climate change and the impact to companies, COVID and the impact to companies, and what we've learned from companies that have responded to COVID, both positively and negatively. There are issues that are impacting society, environment, companies, and also our portfolios. And so let's actually go, we're gonna have a little exercise here. We've got an audience that I think is big enough to do this collaboratively, but we've got, and when we are referencing some companies here, it's not necessarily good news, but we're gonna go through a little bit of a quiz here. So let's start with, and the goal here is to associate the companies with the headline. So what company was hit with a record-setting $1.9 billion penalty over fatal wildfires? Hand in the back. PG&E, Pacific Gas and Electric. That's right. Okay, so what company was associated with a settlement, $650 million settlement linked to facial photo tagging? Sounds like something out of China, but can anybody guess the company? Yes? Facebook is correct. Okay, now what company pled guilty to an $8 billion settlement related to opioids? Yeah, there we go, Purdue Pharmaceutical. 2 left here. Which company was involved with a $20 billion sort of financial impairment, biggest financial impairment ever? This was a company that basically wrote down assets. Very surprising at the time when this happened last year. 2 choices left. ExxonMobil, that's right. Basically admitting that they would not be able to extract in the future enough of their reserves to convert them to money, to commercial activity, which is a big deal at the time. And then lastly, of course, and hopefully some of you in the room weren't impacted, but it was hundreds of millions of people. So maybe likely some of you were, but Equifax had a big data breach back in 2017 and had to pay $575 million to settle that. So there are big issues out there. One of the things that all these issues have in common, of course, is that these are what some would sort of characterize as off-balance sheet risks, non-traditional risks, otherwise known as environmental, social, and governance risks. David, you mentioned these sustainable development goals. I happen to have a slide here with the 17 goals actually laid out. This is another, I think, important development that was not necessarily meant for the investment industry, but what's happening is that more and more investors, particularly institutional investors, but even everyday investors are using these goals as a way to prioritize the things that they will hope to accomplish, work on in their portfolios. As David mentioned, these were put out by the UN Global Compact in 2015. They were meant to sort of coalesce governmental entities, philanthropy, and also private capital to make progress on really the most pressing issues in the world, such as hunger and diversity and inequality. But I raise these just because they are, again, increasingly of importance to investors as they think about their investment portfolios and really the goals and progress that they would like to have through their investments. So let's now pivot. Of course, we're talking about responsible and sustainable investing. Let's now discuss sort of a definition of this. For this, we actually looked to the United Nations. And the definition they have come up with years ago, and this actually dates back to when the PRI, the Principles for Responsible Investing, were established. But it's this process of incorporating ESG, environmental, social, and governance factors, into traditional investment decisions, not to just align investors with their values, but to actually better manage risk and generate sustainable long-term returns. And I think what's happened is that there has been this evolution, and I'm going to touch on it more in a couple of minutes, but we have moved from sort of this values alignment, which is still a priority for many people, to this is just good business. This is a good way to evaluate how companies are managing these issues. So what specifically are we talking about when we think about environmental, social, and governance issues? Another way to think about this is off-balance sheet risks that are increasingly on the balance sheet, non-traditional forms of capital. If we think about environmental issues, think about this as sort of natural capital, companies that are using natural resources and the emissions and externalities that come from that use, issues like carbon emissions and water scarcity. The social issue is really about human capital. And this is a big category because there are a lot of things that companies do that impact people. So engagement issues, diversity issues, gender pay equity issues, data security, product quality and product safety, of course, workplace diversity and workplace safety. Governance, we're thinking about things like executive compensation. We're looking at the board of directors and how independent and diverse is that board of directors, what are pay practices, executive compensation, the ratio between the CEO and sort of the average employee, which is now hundreds to one, when back in the 60s, it was more like 7 to 1. Transparency around auditing practices and controls. And the current state of responsible investing is using this information in conjunction with traditional financial analysis, like price to earnings ratios and return on invested capital and all the traditional measures that investors use, but using this ESG information to create a much more holistic, comprehensive view of how a company is managing all the different things, as we saw a couple of slides ago, absolutely impact companies from a financial perspective. I won't spend a lot of time on this slide, but there has been quite an evolution to the space. The early attempts around responsible investing really came out of the Vietnam War and the anti-war movement. Pax World down the road in Portsmouth was the originator of the concept in the contemporary sense when they launched their Pax World Balanced in 1971. Apartheid issues became prevalent in the late 70s and the 80s. In the 1990s, the tobacco issue really rose to the fore when you had all the states that were suing tobacco companies to help recover the costs of treating tobacco-related illness. In the 2000s, member companies like Enron, I think I can mention that company because it's no longer in business. But sort of corporate governance was a huge issue in the 2000s. And then, of course, as we rolled into the late aughts and into the 2010s, climate issues, and of course, most recently, diversity, inequality issues. You mentioned DEI. Those are very much front and center. And then there was the pandemic, which for all of us in the investment business and investors more broadly was a really a tragic time, obviously, and we continue to experience it today, but an opportunity to see how companies would deal with this issue. There were companies who responded in a very positive way, ensuring that their employees were safe, were protected, had the flexibility to do their job, also flexibility for customers to do sort of curbside pickup, and grocery stores would open early for sort of at-risk and older patrons, customers to come in. And then there were companies who did not respond, who did not take care of their employees, who did not prioritize the safety and well-being of their customers and employees. And many of those companies suffered financially through the pandemic. So the question that came out, and this actually comes from a World Economic Forum survey, which is, how many of you agree with the following statement? I want to see the world change significantly to become more sustainable and equitable rather than returning to how it was before the COVID-19 crisis. Perhaps not surprisingly, the affirmative percentage is higher outside the United States than inside the United States, but still 79% of Americans agreed with this statement compared to 86% outside the country. And what is evolving through this process, and this comes from a Morningstar. Morningstar is a third-party sort of evaluator of investment companies. They do a really nice job. They're a terrific resource actually for investors to sort of evaluate the sustainability of mutual funds and of ETFs. They're a terrific resource. But they have observed, and this came from a recent webinar, where it's, motivations for investing in sustainable and responsible investments. There, of course, you would think classically would be number two, which is we want to improve the world. We want to invest in companies that are part of the solution. We want to sort of align our values with our investments. But interestingly, even more important or more popular in the survey was they think that this is a way to achieve better investment returns. And we have seen this evolution really over time. If we were sitting here 10, 15 years ago, it was socially responsible investing was really sort of the moniker. We didn't even know what ESG was. That was not an acronym that was established. But people saw responsible investing as a way to economically express their values. They thought about, well, I live my life a certain way. I do business with certain companies. I drive a certain car. I want to make sure that my money is aligned with those values. And we absolutely still have those investors today. And I would say they are the foundation of this industry. But what has emerged is this recognition that companies that are doing a great job managing their natural capital, managing their human capital, practicing strong corporate governance, that these are companies that are actually positioned to do well, actually positioned to outperform companies that maybe still have their head in the sand and are not necessarily prioritizing these issues. So while we still have that sort of values-oriented investor, we very much have this kind of traditional or profit-seeking investor as well. So invariably, the question about performance comes up when we start thinking about sustainable investing. And the classic sort of position was, well, it all sounds so good, but you can't nearly make the kind of money that you would make in traditional investments. And so this actually, I'm going to point to a couple of pieces of research that came out. The first one came out of MSCI, which is a prominent ESG data provider and index provider. And what they did is that they looked at 1,600 companies over a 10-year time period, and they ranked those companies based on their ESG performance, their ESG score. So these data providers, they provide data. You can sort of observe a better performing company from an ESG perspective versus an underperforming company. And they organize these companies into quintiles, top 20%, next 20%, bottom 20%, et cetera. And what they found with that top quintile, those companies with the best ESG performance, is they actually were quite attractive from a traditional fundamental investment perspective as well. They tended to be more profitable companies. They tended to have higher dividend yields, which is important for income-oriented investors. They had less systematic volatility. So the market goes down, these companies would typically go down less. Lower cost of capital, which is quite a beneficial thing for investors. And again, lower values for beta. Beta is like standard deviation, it's volatility. So again, less volatile. And these companies also had higher valuations. So there is this premium that companies with strong ESG performance tend to observe. And if you think about it, so you had a couple of connections back to 40, 50 years ago. One of those is frankly the premium or sort of the intangible value versus tangible value. 40 years ago, companies, the majority of their value came from their equipment, their plants, their patents, physical assets. Totally reversed today. Most of the value, particularly in a sector like IT, you mentioned the Coca-Cola example. So much of companies' value today is actually based on their intangible assets. There's their value, and there's a correlation there with ESG. Companies with better ESG performance, higher ESG scores, tend to have kind of higher intangible value and higher premiums. Now, investment performance, so that's looking at individual companies. Let's now think about it in the context of mutual funds and ETFs. This study actually came to the Morgan Stanley Sustainability Institute, which looked at, it was over 10,700 companies, and evaluated how these ESG, how the ESG companies did in relation to the traditional. And the results from the survey might not be that compelling, but it's in the context of dispelling this notion that you have to underperform if you invest this way. And basically, they found there was no statistical difference between an ESG fund and a non-ESG fund. Essentially, ESG funds did not underperform traditional funds. One comment on this, and part of this is we've made progress, but still is a challenge, and David touched on this, which is that we are still operating with a voluntary disclosure framework. It is not a compulsory system. Companies do not have to disclose their carbon emissions, their workplace diversity, even their EEO1 report, which is a report that companies have to provide to the EEOC each year, which shows the diversity of their workplace across a number of different levels across the whole company, not just the board. But in the sort of court of public opinion, investors expect this information. And so while 10 years ago, less than 20% of the S&P 500 companies issued a sustainability report, it's now well over 90%. We still don't have the benefit of a required disclosure framework, and I think we're going to see that. But back in those days, investors would sort of use an exclusionary approach. They would knock out industries or sectors, and it was sort of a blunt instrument, and frankly led to uneven performance. But now we have the benefit of materiality and financial materiality, and we would need several cups of coffee to probably wade into the importance of financial materiality. But this really came out of Harvard Business School about 2015. George Serafeim, who's one of the most popular professors at HBS because he teaches classes about the intersection between financial performance and corporate sustainability. But he and his colleagues were the first to connect the dots around the materiality of these issues, which is what you need to do to be successful. I think this is pretty straightforward. This came out of another survey, which basically said, okay, how many people are interested in responsible investing? Surprisingly, 85% across all demographic groups. I thought that was pretty high, but it's really driven by the millennials. 95% of millennials, see this as an actual imperative. Makes sense. That's really the first generation that has grown up with the greening of our society. I remember growing up in the 70s, there was one electric car in the neighborhood, and it was like this little kind of golf cart kind of thing that the guy plugged into the side of his garage. Now you have performance-oriented electric cars. You've got Whole Foods. You've got community service. You've got, the importance of giving back. So I think millennials are driving this, but we are seeing really people across the demographic scale expressing interest. And perhaps not surprisingly, we're seeing this really strong surging interest in responsible investing. This data comes from Morningstar, a bunch of numbers on this slide, but I'll just point you to the right-hand side, which basically indicates that if we were sitting here 3 years ago in 2018, about $5 billion on a net basis went into the relatively small universe of intentional ESG funds. And that number had been pretty steady, even back in 2014, only about $5 billion. Today, so this last year, so the following year in 2019, it shot up to 20 billion. Last year, over 50 billion went into this universe of just a few hundred of these funds. And a lot of that was driven by sort of the observations from COVID, and these companies actually did quite a bit better. We don't have all the numbers for this year, obviously, but it looks like the flows are going to be even stronger this year than they were last year. And the good news for investors is that there are more options. So if we were sitting here 10, 15 years ago, there were fewer than 100 of these. Difficult to build a diversified portfolio and maybe reach those financial goals. We now have hundreds, nearly 400, and I think at this point, well over 400 funds. So plenty to build a diversified portfolio. However, you also have to be mindful of greenwashing, because greenwashing is a thing. And this gets me to moving quickly here because I'm nearly out of time. And we could do a whole session just on this, but we are anticipating some clarity and some progress from a regulatory standpoint. And you touched on this as well, David. It's likely that the SEC is going to take up some of these issues, start getting companies to disclose this information, investment useful ESG information, which is going to be a big benefit to all of us as investors. It's not on here, but there's also an issue on the retirement side of things. So if you run a company and you want to offer a retirement plan for your employees, it's actually difficult currently to add an ESG fund to the retirement plan. There's something called fiduciary risk that the plan sponsors are exposed to. This was a Trump era thing that he kind of did at the end of his presidency. But Biden has already said that he's not going to enforce the current laws. And in fact, it's in front of the DOL right now to actually revise that. And we think offer a much more supportive language around using ESG funds in retirement, which is where most people do the vast majority of their investing. Last slide for me is that there are a variety of approaches. So there is ESG integration, where a manager is thinking about ESG's issues in addition to traditional fundamental issues. There certainly is screening, which is a totally legitimate and effective way of sort of expressing this concept in your investments. There are thematic portfolios out there. There are social thematic, like diversity issues and DEI. There are environmentally themed strategies that are out there. The good news is that there are many, many, many options. And we haven't even gotten into engagement and proxy voting, but it also is, we think, critical that an investor thinks about these issues as it relates to proxies, and because that's sort of the one democratic part of investing, is that you can vote your proxies, and try to put pressure on companies to improve, sort of tackling important ESG issues, but also hopefully realizing an economic benefit from that activity as well. A couple of great resources. So USSIF.org has a tremendous amount of information out there for people to take a look at. Green Money Journal is a great little newsletter that Cliff Feigenbaum in Santa Fe, New Mexico produces. Really great information about green and ESG investing in finance. And then lastly, Morningstar has a lot of great tools, as I mentioned as well. That concludes my presentation, and perhaps I'll invite David back to the fore, and then we're gonna, I think, take some questions. And there is a microphone over next to the piano that questions are encouraged to be spoken into. And I think there are questions also on the Zoom front that I think that can potentially be posed. And perhaps we've been so comprehensive that there are no questions. Great. Got it.
Okay, so Anna, should we unmute and talk?
Hi. I can't see anybody, so I don't know. I don't think you can see me, but
We hear you though. Hi, Anna.
perfect. Hi. Thank you both for such a great overview presentation. I'm Anna Brown. Glad to be joining remotely. I just was curious to hear either of you, if you have thoughts or reflections on how, as a town, what opportunities may exist as a town in thinking about municipal investments, how those could be used differently or in a way that's strategic or intentional around climate outcomes in particular, but or ESG more broadly. I'm just curious if you see entry points or opportunities.
So it sounds like a question about, are there opportunities within the town? And I'm not sure if it's the town's investments, or she also mentioned municipal issuance, municipal securities. ESG municipal investments is definitely a thing. I'm not sure that Freeport is an issuer of municipal bonds, but certainly more broadly through the state of Maine. And there's definitely issuance, and there are impact themes, both social and environmental, that an investor can prioritize through their municipal investments. But we might not have had that question. Did I have that right, Anna? Oh, did we lose you? Did you have other thoughts related to that, David?
Okay, Anna, if you want to go ahead again.
Oh, yeah. Well, if David had reflections.
Well, there are certain things that the town can do to provide opportunity for people to be more sustainable. Many of which you can also come.
I mean, I think that I'm pretty sure Anthony answered the kernel of your question in terms of what Bob just raised about the town can invest in. Again, I love the slide. Can you talk about, Anthony, your slide?
What was on the slide?
Yeah. There's again, back to, if you, Anna, I know you and I know what you do in the world, but for other people too, I think that's the slide. Oh no, sorry, it's one with Carissa SEC.
Oh, yeah, the regulatory front.
Anna and others, there are, as Anthony said, and I think I alluded to a little bit, there's a ton of movement in this country. I think Anthony did a beautiful job, and these slides are available, they will be available. Almost there. Wait, no, sorry. Looking at the different things happening in the states, what's not on here, because the slide would be so busy nobody could read it, is to your point in the things happening at the town, city, county, state. I would even say regional, like Reggie, regional association, and sort of more local, small L, big L issues. There are bond pools and other ways that Freeport could theoretically get involved, but that's almost a political thing, that issue that we probably want a town council member and a town manager. But there are lots of creative things that towns are doing around this country. I would say arguably even more interesting things happening in Europe and Japan, Switzerland, and one or two other places that are very localized, and there's a reason why they couldn't have. They're not.
So Anna, did that question come through? Did you have more you wanted to add to that?
No, that's very helpful. It was a little bit hard to hear the whole response just because of the like distance from the microphone, but I think I got a sense of it, and I think it's just something that I think there is scope for some additional follow-up just amongst other folks in town who might be interested in this. But I appreciate the response from both of you.
Awesome. Thank you, Anna. And if anybody else on Zoom has questions that they want to bring forward, just please raise your hand. And you can do so on the bottom of the screen.
I think you need to come to this one.
Okay. I have actually a very broad question. I was interested in, on David's slide, he had the difference between the 60s and now, and some of those things obviously won't change, the change from local to global, and it's a result of technology. But the issue of trust, which is significant, something I deal with in my work, and I'm wondering if you agree that a lot of that was corporate driven, the loss of trust, and is it going to take something like regulation only, or do you see other ways? Because when the whole greening and the mission statements came out, then there was the immediate backlash with the greenwashing, because we saw that not all of it was accurate. So, and I know you had talked about them not releasing carbon data and things like that. So I'm just curious what you two think is the best way to reestablish trust, and if you agree that the corporations had a lot to do with kind of dissolving that.
You're welcome to go first.
No, I had a slide of trust also.
Oh,
No.
Megan, do you want to take that? You sure? Wow, there's a company called Edelman, Edelman. They do something called the Trust Barometer. And Anthony mentioned the World Economic Forum. They have their big annual meeting in Davos, Switzerland, every January. And it's actually happening in person next year in January. And they've already pre-published the latest results. So look for the Edelman Trust Barometer. And it's this really interesting, almost real-time analysis of where people stand, not just on business, but on government and other things. So it's sort of all things trust, and they kind of own that space. My response, particularly interesting because my wife's in the room and maybe one of my kids out west is listening in, but I've made a professional decision to move away from this issue and work on technology where trustless will be the outcome. There's too much space. I'm not naming any names. I'm not making any eye contact where, we have greenwashing. There's rainbow washing. Ever heard of that? There's SDG washing. You could wash everything. Wash behind your ears. Wash between your toes. There's every kind of washing available. And so data that is manipulable is most data in the world. And if you go back to that slide I posted where the head of fixed income at a giant North American bank said most of it is BS, that should raise red flags for everybody. I don't care if you're invested in bonds or not. That's just unconscionable. So yeah, trust is a massive issue. And I think it's really hard to understand where you start and who you can trust. But I think making clear to elected officials, to the brands that you support and others that you expect to be talked to as a grown-up, you expect to have up to a certain level disclosure that would help you make an informed decision. And I think in Anthony's world, to his point, we're now expecting that. I mean, we own these companies. You know, you own as an investor these companies. And so you have a right to know a lot more than is being disclosed to you. So from a trust perspective, it's really hard in a world where I don't think many of us know what trust is anymore. So I'm moving sort of into the technology place where machines will do this work for us. And there'll be no intermediary space where a human being can manipulate it because a lot of stuff is made up. And it's really hard to trust what you see. You shouldn't trust anything I've just said, maybe.
I can't be the only one in the room without a mascot, so I'll join you. But I was going to mention the Edelman Trust Barometer as well. That's really, really interesting research. And I think one of the findings from the research is that, because they do the survey, which is okay, who do you trust the most and the least? And governments are among the very lowest in terms of trust. I think trust is pretty high with like sort of non-governmental NGOs, I think, but I think the trust is actually highest among companies. I mean, people trust Apple, right? I mean, people trust, think of how much time we all spend on their devices. And so I think if we totally understand your point about greenwashing, and that's where the importance of having data that goes through the auditing system, right? I mean, what SASB is doing is they're trying to create ESG disclosure framework that follows FASB, the financial, standard that is set up. So we need more eyeballs on the data. We want vetting of the data. And then I think companies have this opportunity, given the fact that they already sort of hold a lot of the trust in investors, they have that opportunity to deliver in not a greenwashing way.
So is the problem of trust more prevalent in the States, or will we have a bigger problem here than elsewhere? Repeat the question.
The one that we answered?
Yeah, so what you just asked.
Yeah. So I don't know that I know the answer to this. You probably do. But is there the trust in the US versus outside the United States? Are people more or less trustworthy outside the US than in the US? Probably is regional and country by country. You have a perspective on that?
Well, that's such a good question. It's almost unfair. Spoken by an Argentine. Yeah, in my experience, yeah, I mean, I think it depends. I've worked the last 5 years, I'm looking at my wife because she counts well too, for Swiss-based organizations. In my experience, Europeans and the Swiss have much higher expectations that companies disclose information that then that consumer and or investor can make a more informed decision. If they have a lower threshold for BS and a high expectation that companies be upfront with them. That doesn't mean that we don't in the States. I think Canada may have a culture that is slightly in between us and the EU and Switzerland. We used to do a lot of work with Canadian companies and investors, and I guess I still do. I would say if you thought about my slide from 1961 to 2021, the thing that I would caution is that it's, and I'm not disagreeing with Anthony, if you remember my thesis, we have accounting principles and practices that are in the Pleistocene age. So I don't trust them. I don't trust that the SASB, and boy, Anthony was probably looking, my slide that I showed is already outdated and coming out of the Glasgow climate COP26. So it's already outdated. There were some announcements made there, but I don't actually think that 20th century accounting practices and principles are going to get us out of this 21st century problem. And I think that that is being rethought too. And you'll watch, if we're back in this room in 5 years, your wallets will be primarily digital. I mean, a lot of what is happening that is transformative will force a change in practices that might enable better trust. It's hard to know, but I would say, to answer your question, Europeans trust less and have higher expectations, and companies therefore keep looking over to somebody who lived and worked in one of these places. And here we're not way at the other end, but slightly somewhere else. And in my experience, Canada might be somewhat in between.
And I think relatedly, you're also seeing more regulation come out of Europe that some of which we probably need here. So there's an SFDR right now, Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, which any manager in Europe has to basically follow. And you have to categorize your funds on no ESG, integrated ESG, highest standard of ESG, sort of impact with impact expectations and outcomes. And so I think that's an example of the European regime holding investors accountable to that. And I think for the benefit of investors over there, investment companies to the benefit of their investors.
It's like, whose dance card is it, right, Anthony?
Yeah.
I would just, again, Vali, I think that if between the food waste comment and BIS.org, the Bank for International Settlements, is significant. It announced it's something called its Green Swan Conference. So black swan events are like the pandemic. Green swan events are climate change. So again, the Central Bank of Central Banks voted in this June, which is part of why I made this change I made in my career, to require climate risk disclosure in their lending. So these are the banks that lend to governments, and these are the banks that lend to governments that lend to, let's pick Germany. You loan to Germany, then Germany loans to Deutsche Bank, then Deutsche Bank loans to Volkswagen. And these central banks, 8 of the 9 largest central banks in the world, are requiring climate risk disclosure in their lending going forward. That's tectonic. Absolutely tectonic. And it's for the reasons that Anthony said, because well-managed companies manage risk well, and poorly managed companies don't manage risk well. And it's not the perfect proxy for deciding that, but it is now going to become part of how finance is done globally. Pretty cool. And the only way we're going to do that is, again, through not relying on self-reporting. I mean, Vali, you know my kids. I think I'm a decent dad, but I don't get to be the judge of that. You do, and my kids do, and my community does. So why do we let people tell us how good they are?
Yeah, thank you. Just a follow-up question for both of you. Looking at sort of the sustainability, holding people responsible, trying to elevate this culture to one of trust, or where we're working at a level where we are focusing on sustainability. How do we hold people accountable? So, I mean, is that, we can say, put your money where your values are, something like that, choosing with whom we invest. But, looking at the Glasgow conference, 503 representatives from the oil companies were there. They had been told a month before publicly that they were not going to be involved. Yet we're inviting these people who are coming there and saying that their focus, these companies, is on solar, is on renewables. You look at their data, and yes, that might be their focus, but it's less than 1% of their current portfolio. So, they have just put in billions on this, with this hand, and then saying, hey, look at what we're doing. BP changing its name 10 years ago, instead of being British Petroleum, be Beyond Petroleum, because they had just put in 4 million in a solar thing. Meanwhile, spending 25 billion on an oil plant that same summer, but they're changing their name so that we think of them differently. How do we, as consumers, think about changing this culture beyond just, our personal Freeport, Maine, I'm here, where do I invest? these are the same people we're inviting in to sort of solve our problem.
Welcome your involvement as well, David. But I don't have the answer. I mean, it's super complicated. I think we can influence by our behaviors, by our activities. So we don't invest in fossil fuel companies that own reserves. And we think that that's based on, that's not a values arrangement. That's just, it just makes sense from an investment perspective. You have to look out 30 plus years, but at some point it's going to be difficult for these companies to extract those resources and convert them to commercial activity to support their valuations. And so there's big time risk. And so that's not necessarily a moral values argument against fossil fuel or oil. That's just dollars and cents. That's just, sort of the economic situation. And I think an argument like that will influence some people. There's this net zero pledge that's going around right now, which in many ways is sort of a toothless pledge, because you're committing to being on a net zero path, a Paris aligned path, at some point with presumably some milestones, but it has a 2050 end date. So there are companies that are able to get value from committing to it today when they don't have to really deal with it for a long time. And so I think, there's a net zero asset managers initiative that many investors have signed up for. And it's up to that organization to press and hold accountable the investors that are, potentially experiencing some economic benefit from that pledge, but aren't doing a lot today to kind of realize that goal. So I'm just thinking, I mean, from our kind of industry perspective, we're trying to use capital to identify the companies that are doing a good job with the pressing challenges and align with those companies and encourage other investors to join. And then there's companies that are not doing a great job, that are exposed to risk. And those are the companies that will have to, and there are some leaders and there are some laggards, but there are a lot of companies in the messy middle. And I think there are a lot of companies that are going to get it. It might require some engagement to encourage those companies along. But I think that's where that's a really interesting part of the marketplace, is those companies where the light bulb will invariably go off and are going to be part of the change, part of the positive change that we really hope to see. Yes.
You mentioned proxies.
Yes.
Are there any funds that are consciously using proxies to take the question that Suzanne asked to the shareholder meeting?
Absolutely. Yeah. So are there any funds out there that are basically exercising their engagement opportunity to vote proxies, to engage with management, to press companies to improve? Absolutely. I mean, I would say if you go to that industry site, the ussif.org, that's one of the data points on the various mutual fund companies that are out there. Do you have an engagement policy? It should be spelled out in the prospectus, which is a legal document for all the funds and ETFs. It wasn't necessarily an organization that I would say describe as sort of a responsible investor, but engine number two, which it was sort of a investment company that organized around Exxon and successfully got a couple of very supportive climate scientists, advocates on the board at Exxon. And so I think engagement, proxy voting, that's a critical tool. It's a critical tool in the toolbox to press for change. And there are many investment companies that do that. And they're essentially doing that work on your behalf, because it's hard to do. You're going to end up owning hundreds of companies in a mutual fund or an ETF, and it's very difficult for you to do all that work yourself. So you're essentially outsourcing, but leveraging your votes, your investments, along with thousands of others. There's a report card. There's a track record that an investor can evaluate on how managers vote these proxies. Good question. Sure.
So we're beyond our allotted time frame for our guest speakers. Thank you so much, both of you, for offering your expertise and enlightening us on how to move forward. I appreciate everyone who showed up here in person, and also all those who met us via Zoom. I would remind anyone who's here in person to please sign the contact tracing sheet if you haven't done so already. And also just publicizing our next lectures. We have one coming up every month through May. So hopefully you will be able to attend those and join our future speakers to continue to learn about how to become more sustainable and hopefully make this ball forward, move forward and improve the world. Thank you so much. Good evening.